All right, guys, let's finish up our discussion of some of the basics of enzyme behavior by considering how this conformational change stuff can be used in other ways. We just had a discussion in the last video of the idea of conformational changes in enzymes. All right, the idea that enzymes are not just little, or proteins in general, not just little rocks, right? They're dynamic and they interact by a consequence of thermodynamic linkage between ligand binding and conformational change to optimize their structures, right? For doing chemistry, right? For catalysis. That catalysis is linked in enzymes to conformational changes that optimize that catalysis. This idea, by linking conformational changes to catalysis, was first sort of formalized, of course, by Dan Koshland at UC Berkeley in the 1950s. And it got a name. Dan called it the induced fit hypothesis, right? And it's probably not even a hypothesis anymore. It's pretty well confirmed, right? And the reason he had to sort of fight against an entrenched view is up to that point for, several decades, 50 years, people thought of proteins as little, basically, non-dynamic rocks, right? And the previous idea about how enzymes interacted with their substrates was sometimes referred to as the sort of lock and key idea. It's like fitting a static puzzle piece into a three-dimensional puzzle piece into a three-dimensional hole, like a key and a lock, right? Dan and others who worked with Dan and other enzymes basically blew that completely out of the water. And this whole idea of these thermodynamically linked conformational changes between the protein, the enzyme structure, and the substrate is now very much at the core of how we understand how enzymes work. Okay, but there's another aspect to conformational changes in enzymes that, rather than just being linked to catalysis, are linked to control, right? Specifically, how an enzyme responds under a given set of conditions. All right, and to illustrate that, consider something like the following. Let's say I had a substrate molecule or something, we'll call it A, right? And A turns into B, and B turns into C, and C turns into D, and D turns into X, right? And we got a set of enzymes here. We got enzyme 1, enzyme 2, enzyme 3, enzyme 4, right? So we have this multi-step sequence of conversions, which of course you guys will hopefully recognize as a pathway. This is an idea that's very important, as you'll remember, in biochemistry, and we're going to be talking about a lot going forward. So we've got 4 enzymes. We've got 5 different species, 4 enzymes. Let's imagine that this pathway, in addition to having all these enzymes and all these steps, let's say this, making X is not cheap. Right? So what if, let's say, let's say, I don't know, this requires some input of energy, right? Say we got to hydrolyze some ATP here, right? So making X, while absolutely essential, right? Because let's say you die without it, right? Your organism dies without it. It's not cheap. Okay. So that means you only want to make X when you need it. And as long as you need it, you want to make it. But when you don't need it, you want to stop making it. Right? So the question is, how do you build a system that does that? Right? Well, it seems like the simplest way, the most parsimonious way, is you need to build a sensor that can detect the concentration of X and then respond. Okay, we could do that, right? We could build something that would bind X, recognize it, right? We've studied hemoglobin. We know that that kind of thing is possible. Where'd you put it? Where do you put the sensor? Well, given that we've got multiple steps, we've got investment of all these enzymes, we've got at least 2 ATP utilizing steps, seems like the most parsimonious, the most energetically efficient place to put it would be right here at the beginning, right? You put the sensor back here at that first step somewhere so that when you've made enough, you don't use the rest of this pathway. You don't have these other intermediates building up, right? You just stop right at the very beginning. You tell the pathway, okay, I'm good. Don't make any more for now, right? Okay. All right, well, what about, here's another idea. Let's say I got a different kind of pathway. In this case, not a linear pathway, but a sort of a network. Let's say I have a substrate A that, whoops, let's be a little less sloppy, turns into B, which turns into C, let's say, and we got 2 enzymes. Now we got 2 enzymes here in the main pathway, E1, E2. But now, let's say B is like a super important. It's like a central node in multiple different pathways, right? B is used for, 3 or 4 different alternate pathways that need it for making other stuff, right? So we've got different enzymes over here that need B for various things, right? So that, you got to have B around, and all these pathways are important, right? If you don't have B around, all of this stuff sort of shuts down, right? But at the same time, if there's too much B around, what if there's another bad thing that happens? What if B can interact with itself, right? And do something bad, right? It makes X, and X is like super bad. X is like, I don't know, some deadly toxin. You make X, you're dead. So now we've got a pathway design, or a network, a series of pathways linked into a network, that it really, really, really matters how much B there is at any given time. You better not let the concentration of B get too out of hand, or you got problems. If it gets too high, right, you make X and you die. Okay. Oops. But if you don't have enough B, all these other pathways shut down and you die, right? So in this case, what you could think of is sort of this enzyme 2. You need to make C, right? But maybe it's not as essential. What really matters here is the concentration of B. And you could think about this enzyme 2, or this step 2, as sort of a safety valve. Okay, well, how do you build this thing? What do you do to make something that can sense and control the concentration of B? How on earth do you do that? All right. It turns out the answer to both of these problems, and a whole host of additional problems, is to make something that I alluded to in my title, which is to make certain key enzymes, so-called allosteric, right? And this is a key idea in biochemistry, in enzymology, in metabolism, is the idea of allosteric enzymes, right? By no means are all enzymes allosteric, right? What we're going to see as we go along is that there are certain really critical enzymes that are made allosteric to solve problems like the 2 that I just sort of set up for you right here, right? And what's often true, these allosteric enzymes, is these are often oligomeric enzymes, right? Now, by no means are all enzymes oligomeric, and not all oligomeric enzymes are allosteric, but the vast majority of allosteric enzymes do turn out to be oligomers, because what we're going to basically see when we look at some detailed examples of these, I'm going to give you a big picture today, is that we're going to take the ideas that we worked out in terms of cooperativity with hemoglobin. We're going to take those ideas and we're now going to layer those onto enzyme kinetics. And when you do that, you manage to build enzymes that allow you to solve problems like these and a whole host more, right? Okay, So just some big picture ideas here, right, to start out with. There are sort of two basic limiting ways in which one can build an allosteric enzyme, right? There are so-called K-type systems and versus V-type allosteric enzymes. And the distinction comes down to the way in which the enzyme responds to an allosteric effector, whether the effect is all coming essentially through substrate binding, which you could imagine is going to be K-type substrate binding, or more accurately, saturation, right? Because you can't always assume, as we've seen, thermodynamic equilibrium, or through turnover, right? Okay. Now, it's, excuse me, not all that common. Again, I'm not going to proffer how common, but I don't know off the top of my head a lot of examples of allosteric enzymes that are purely one or the other. Different allosteric enzymes tend more towards a K-type or V-type, but many of them show some characteristics of both, even if they're sort of more dominantly in one direction or the other, right? But in the limiting case, it's sort of useful to sort of think about it that way. It's a little bit easier to think about it that way. So let's think about a pure K-type system. What does that mean, right? Okay. So for a pure K-type allosteric enzyme, all of the effect of the allosteric behavior, right? All the cooperativity that we're going to think about here in a second, happens at the level of the effective Km of the substrate, right? Or more correctly, at the level of the amount of substrate needed to achieve, that half saturation point, right? So in some cases, this could be thermodynamic equilibrium. Lots and lots of these enzymes are, substrate is not in thermodynamic equilibrium, but still the same ideas, and we talked about it before, apply. The amount of substrate you need to reach half saturation is sort of the focal point of this sort of allosteric control, right? And in both cases, both types of system, this sort of allosteric control, right, can be expressed as either homotypic effects or heterotypic. In the case of lots of enzymes that are lots of allosteric enzymes, both, and in some cases, not just both homotypic and heterotypic, but multiple different types of heterotypic allosteric effectors, right? So the sort of layers of control here start to get amazingly and beautifully complex, right, in some ways. All right, so like I said before, the big picture idea here is we're going to take some of the ideas of cooperativity we talked about from the point of view of hemoglobin. Remember that T to R transition and that change in affinity, and we're going to layer on top of that the ideas of enzyme kinetics, right? So again, thinking about a pure K-type system, right, where the effects, again, are all going to be happening at the level of Km, which means one other thing for a pure K-type system here, right, the Vmax for a pure K-type system is unaffected, right, by the allosteric control that's imposed, right? Vmax is going to be the same, okay. But the way this expresses itself in the following, if we think about, right, Michaelis-Menten plot, like we've been doing, concentration of substrate, initial rate. And if you think about the classic Michaelis-Menten enzyme, like we've been thinking about it, that's what it would look like, right? There's that hyperbolic curve, right? There it is going up to its Vmax, right? That's everything we've talked about for the last, week and a half, right? Now, we've built an enzyme that we need to have, or we've built an allosteric enzyme, one that's going to respond through homotypic positive cooperativity to its substrate, right? Think, what might that look like? Again, we're not looking directly at binding. The readout here is the initial rate, and we're still under initial rate conditions, right? So we're large substrate excess and all that kind of stuff. But that rate now is going to change, instead of hyperbolically with substrate concentration, sigmoidally, right? So we would get a curve. If you remember back to our discussions of hemoglobin, we get a curve that, oh, that's ugly. Let me draw that again. I can do better than that. That maybe we'll do something more like this. Oh, still ugly. Right, that shows a sigmoid, but you'll notice, right, at low substrate concentration, the enzyme is super low activity, almost off, right? And then as the substrate concentration goes up, we get now this rapid nonlinear response. The enzyme goes faster, faster, and faster, and faster across a much narrower range of substrate concentration than the sort of classic non-cooperative Michaelis-Menten type hyperbolic plot, right? But the system, again, is now heading up toward the same Vmax when you get to large enough substrate excess, because, as I said, we're thinking here about a K-type allosteric enzyme, right? Okay. But that's an example of what homotypic cooperativity would look like. Many enzymes that do this, you don't have to just stop there, right? You can have heterotypic effects, right? So here, again, here's that plot, concentration of substrate. And here, again, we're looking at the initial rate. Here's our allosteric enzyme responding to substrate, right? There's that Vmax again, right? Okay, but now imagine we have an enzyme. This enzyme can not only responds with a positive homotypic cooperativity to the substrate itself, but now this enzyme can also respond to heterotypic effectors, right? Again, with analogy back to hemoglobin, think about protons and oxygen, right? So we come in with some other molecule, not the substrate. And this other molecule or other molecules could either push the protein towards its more active or less active state. Because remember that the simple-minded way to think about this, right, or a way to think about this, is if you think back to that those models of cooperativity, you can think about this allosteric enzyme, again, as transitioning between T and R states, where the T state, right, is less active, right? And in this case, that would mean it has a higher K-type system, higher Km, right? And the opposite is true for the R state of the enzyme. The R state then has a lower Km, right? So it takes less substrate to saturate the enzyme. Okay, what that would look like then, with respect to these initial rate curves, in the presence of an inhibitor, you push the enzyme more towards the T state, right? So it looks something more like this, right? So this is with a sort of a hetero effector, heterotypic effector, which you would call an inhibitor. And well, let's not call it an inhibitor. That's going to get, let's not use that terminology. That's going to potentially get confusing with what we just talked about. This is a heterotypic effector, right? But it's pushing it towards the T state, towards the less active conformation of the enzyme. But, like I said, we can also have an allosteric effector that binds to the R state, right? Pulls this equilibrium in this direction, in which case the enzyme would do something more like this, right? Okay, so in this case, we have heterotypic effector that's sort of positively cooperative, if you want to think about it that way, right? Or is pushing the enzyme towards the R state, right? Okay. So now, hopefully, you're starting to get a sense of some of the things you can do with an enzyme like this, at least in principle. Now the question is, if I go back to those initial problems that I was thinking about, right, that I posed, and this idea of an allosteric enzyme, how do you solve these problems? Hopefully, now, maybe, that seems sort of a bit more obvious to you guys. In this case, right, what you would do for my first problem of I've got an enzyme that we need a sensor for the output of a very expensive pathway. Well, if we put that sensor right here, we make that first enzyme an allosteric enzyme that responds through heterotypic cooperativity to the product of that pathway, right? So that when the product builds up, this enzyme shuts down. And when this product X disappears, depletes, this pathway ramps up again, right? So this is an example of something we're going to see again. It's known as feedback control, right? And it depends absolutely on these ideas of allosteric enzymes that I just described for you guys. What about this guy? What about my second problem here? How do you solve that one? Well, the design idea here, again, is that we need to control the concentration of B. We need to keep this under, some really tight control, right? And using an allosteric enzyme provides a really simple way to do that, because in this case, all you have to do, right, is make that E2 enzyme allosteric with respect to B itself, right? So if that E2 enzyme, we make E2 respond to the concentration of B as a positive homotypic response, right? This enzyme is now going to do something, it's going to do something more like this, right? It's going to be, and if we make it really tightly responsive, look at what happens, right? So if the concentration of B builds up, and remember, we don't want the concentration to get too high. Concentration of B builds up, this enzyme ramps up its activity, and it does it across, in my little toy model here, a really narrow range of B concentration, right? So as the concentration of B coming in builds up, this guy is going to crank up and start depleting the concentration of B. But as that happens and the B concentration drops, goes back in this direction, this enzyme slows way back down again, right? And it slows way back down to the point that once we get to this concentration down here, it's, enzyme 2, production C, slows way, way, way down. And all you have to do now is have this point here be the sort of set point for these other enzymes, right? So that they're perfectly happy as long as the concentration of B is in this range. And what this sort of control enzyme, E2, is going to do, it's going to buffer changes in the concentration of B. And it's going to keep B, right, in this very narrow range of concentrations, or it will help keep it in that very narrow range of concentrations, which would keep this from happening, right? But maintain enough of B so that these connected pathways can all maintain the flux they need to maintain for whatever has to happen, right? So again, this depends upon this idea of building an allosteric enzyme with this nonlinear response in its activity, its turnover, relative to the concentration of its substrate. Okay, now we're going to build on those ideas to start doing some higher level biology as we put some metabolic pathways together.